Hello and welcome to another edition of TechLaunch in the News. Let's get into it. Welcome to another edition of Software Security and Performance in the News. Let's dive into this edition. Start out by talking about best ways to incorporate security into the software development lifecycle. Pretty basic concept, but not easy to execute on. First, a secure SDLC must incorporate security measures such as a code review, pen testing, and architecture analysis. So ask yourself, if you're working on security and you're going through a process of auditing your SDLC, where are big opportunities that you can inject this concept of security and performance as well throughout that SDLC? And so that's really what this article is talking about. So starting right out in the requirements gathering phase, they talk about how you can ask key questions during that process. Just the fact that you're asking these questions many times can help drive the right behavior throughout the organization. So how quickly can the software recover from a security attack? And what security techniques can protect the software from security attacks? Really simple questions, but if you get firm answers to these types of questions, and these specific ones are great, then it can really transform the way the entire organization and that particular team is implementing this SDLC. That's just one example. You can kind of go on and see some more during the design phase. Common software vulnerabilities are usually caused by adopting the wrong technologies in software development. Easy to say in hindsight, of course, but how can you analyze during that design phase? What are some of the different kind of threat models you can analyze? What are some of the different discussions you can have within your organization and possibly even with experts external to your organization to understand what the kind of common technology issues might be and how to mitigate those? Going on development phase, internal and external software teams and software development tools and choosing those properly. Implementation phase, tools that automate code review can be deployed at this phase and set up for a thorough code analysis. Now, this is something that's a pretty mature aspect of software security and performance analysis, is setting up these third-party tools during the implementation phase, as well as the testing phase. So you can see here, if you kind of zoom in, let me do that. Some of these different tools during the testing phase would include, of course, pen testing, fuzz testing. So you're putting in bad data essentially to see if there are vulnerabilities, and interactive application security testing. So this is a combination of the two of DAST and SAST testing techniques. And it basically ensures that potential vulnerabilities are detected during runtime. So you're actually running your application and testing like crazy with different approaches. Now, ultimately, the big kind of takeaway here is that if you are really designing everything from the beginning and you're kind of thinking about security from day one, and then following it all the way through post-deployment and maintenance, developers can usually prevent a lot of major issues, and the overall team can by driving this kind of adoption within your organization of kind of this culture of looking at software security and performance from really day one. And so that's kind of the key takeaway. They wrap up by talking about patching and hardware updates, using security scan tools, etc. But really the key takeaway is adopting it within your culture. Okay, let's take a look at the next article. This one's talking about 10 women in cybersecurity who predict software security trends. This is a really well done article. Basically, they talk about key areas. I've highlighted a few of those that I want to just briefly go over. SBOMs. So software bill of material. Have you ever heard of that before? This is a new term, a relatively new term. One of the concepts here, though, is that whenever you're dealing with supply chain, software supply chain security, a lot of it has to do with open source software that has security vulnerabilities. And so you basically want to make this bill of materials so you can see everything that's going into your software. Now, they go into more detail in the article, but that is a huge opportunity to kind of think. And if you kind of go back to this idea of architecting from day one and planning in the SDLC, this is a really helpful thought process. The next thing that we see here is automating open source supply chain validation. So the validation part of it is really key. So being able to literally crawl through everything that's open source and just think of it as like a contribution, but that might be suspect. And so how can you go through and automatically validate everything yourself and reduce the risk by proactively doing that? Assume that it is a zero trust environment for external software, especially. That's really a big target. So obviously focusing on that is going to pan out. So it goes on to talk about how that it goes beyond supply chain risk, goes beyond open source code. It can include third-party tools as well. Tighter coupling of security and development. Now, this is a big challenge from an ideological perspective for a lot of organizations. So you've got to essentially imbue the culture with this idea and really just the reality, just the truth of the matter, that security and performance are absolutely critical. And really without those, the development opportunity would not be there. And it is a challenge, but essentially this is a big opportunity for security and performance leaders to collaborate with DevOps and with development overall to implement. Automation remains the AppSec brass ring. So what are they talking about here? Well, basically, secure today might not be so tomorrow, and attack methods will keep on changing. So they're saying that essentially that when it comes to supply chain and knowing which ingredients have gone into every piece of software, working in synchronicity and contributing to ongoing risk is one of the realities. Essentially that, the entire threat landscape has to be considered. And unfortunately, that's just going to continue to be a massive challenge going forward. So AppSec, application security, misconfigurations and permissive access, it's like leaving the front door unlocked. This happens all the time. And the reality is there's a lot of pressure on developers, DevOps, on all the different roles, SecOps, etc. And unfortunately, some of the most basic things can be left undone. This can really be as simple as putting checklists in place and automating as much of that as possible, using scripting and that kind of a thing to audit and check for these things. But, lock the front door essentially. Volume of work is a huge challenge. And I just kind of spoke to that a little bit. It creates basic issues like leaving the front door unlocked. And then finally, the recognition that gatekeeping doesn't work with DevSecOps. So this is interesting as well. So it used to be possible for, essentially the ability to put on, major infrastructure and that kind of a thing. But if you look at the OWASP 10 and you look at some of the key concepts, it really hasn't changed a lot since 2003. And so really you have to have developers who actually understand these security concepts and incorporate resolution to those and proactiveness within the development phase. It's not enough just to put a big hardware or security firewall or that kind of thing in place. Okay, let's take a look at the next article. Okay, so around this idea of security and how there are big issues with open source software, there was a recent meeting in Austin, Texas, and basically 41% of organizations said they are not confident in the security of open source software that they use. So this is a big meeting, in the open source summit in Austin, and they were talking about how the LinuxFoundation released this data recently. And we actually talked about that in a previous YouTube video. And they go on to say that I think the software industry this year really woke up to not only the fact that these earthquakes were happening, but how it's getting more and more expensive to recover from them. And that's absolutely the case. I mean, you're not only dealing with physical issues with security, but you're dealing with credibility. You have major culture changes that have to happen within organizations. This could really disrupt some of the investment and some of the reduction of investment necessary by having to use non-open source or check for vulnerabilities from open source. And that adds so much friction that maybe it makes sense to make something on our own instead of using something open source. There are considerations that go into play. The open source security mobilization plan, this $150 million commitment that came out of this event as kind of a solution to some of this big challenge, it essentially identifies 10 areas that will be targeted for attention. And so this includes the list that you can see here, a lot around education and kind of best practices versus solving some of the problems. There are some that are kind of getting into solving actual problems, but a lot of it is around education and standardizing those best practices. So take a look at this and make sure that you're implementing some of these things, if not hopefully all of them. And a lot of times it's a matter of prioritizing these so you can focus on the key areas first, obviously. But ultimately, this kind of price tag for the initiatives of $150 million is just going to get things started. And really, that's kind of the conclusion of this, is that ultimately there is a huge gap in the market with open source software security, and it's going to require ongoing investment, especially in these key areas that you're seeing here. Let's take a look at the last article now. Okay, so this one is really just talking about data around the opportunity with software security. Basically, the software-defined security within the market is going to be a $19.2 billion worldwide space by 2026. And so you can see some of these concepts in this research article that was done. And I've just highlighted a few things here below. So the global market for software-defined security is estimated at $3.8 billion today, and it's projected to reach a revised size of $19.2 billion by 2026. So that is a 30.9% growth rate, compounded annual growth rate. Specifically within this, application and mobile device security, as well as if you kind of read on, you can see there's a lot of growth projected as well in a couple of other key areas. Virtual machines, server storage security, as well as expected to grow quite rapidly. And ultimately, if you kind of go into this research, you'll see there are different regions that are also estimated to grow quite rapidly. Network security gateways is another segment that's expected to grow quite rapidly. And so these are things that we recommend digging into if you haven't already. But wow, I mean, what a validation of the security space for software in particular. 19.2 billion by 2026. That is a massive growth rate. We believe there is a massive opportunity here. We will continue to keep you apprised, and we hope that you found this particular edition helpful. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next edition of Software Security and Performance in the News. Thanks for watching this edition of TechLaunch in the News. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe so you can see more in the news resources. We also have complimentary masterclasses and other resources available to you on our website, www.gotechlaunch.com. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them in the comments section. And until next time, thanks for watching and bye for now.